The appointed hour has arrived, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this Wheeler Center lecture. The Wheeler Center has been active for over 30 years in addressing issues of great importance to Montana and Montanans. We address issues like early childhood education, the graying of Montana, the next economy, divisiveness in democracy, the future of coal. Those are some of the conferences that we've done in the past few years. We also sponsor distinguished lecturers, and we're just so very pleased to have another one with us tonight. I think you'll also be very pleased when you hear what he has to say. And here to introduce him is one of his colleagues. Oh, wait a minute. Before I call you up, Brad, I would like to recognize all of the Wheeler Center board members in the room. Would you please rise? Okay. Good. The hum went away before our speaker came. Excuse me? Oh, I have not been introduced. Introduce yourself. My name is Chuck Tooley. I'm the chairman of the board of the Wheeler Center for Public Policy. And it's my pleasure now to introduce the immediate past chair of the Wheeler Center, Dr. Brad Snow.
Thanks, Chuck. We're very fortunate to have Chuck as our board chair. And thanks to you all for coming out tonight for what promises to be a really wonderful lecture. It is my very real honor and privilege to introduce Dr. David Large to you all this evening. I'm extremely pleased that he was able to accept our introduction to come and speak here tonight on behalf of the Wheeler Center. I've had the good fortune to know David for I guess about 27 years now. I first took a class from him. I've known him since 91 when I moved out here, and I first took a course from him in 92. I took his Russian history course back when Russia really mattered, and it seems to matter again now. And then I took his excellent 19th century European history course the following year, which he taught just through the use of novels and his own notes on yellow legal pad paper, much like this. This is a homecoming for David. As many of you know, he's a native son of Montana, having grown up in Billings and attended Billings Senior High School. And then he spent 30 years teaching in the history and philosophy and religious studies department at Montana State. Following his undergraduate study at the University of Washington, David earned his MA and PhD degrees in history from UC Berkeley. David taught back east for a number of years at Smith College and Yale University, which has been in the news lately, before returning to Montana in 1983 to teach at MSU. David's CV is a truly weighty document, longer than many scholarly articles I've read. By my quick count, he has written or served as editor of more than a dozen books, along with dozens of articles and book chapters. His most recent book, which I really want to read, I haven't yet, released in 2015, is The Grand Spas of Central Europe, A History of Intrigue, Art, Politics, and Healing. And his previous two books focused on the German-hosted Olympic Games of 1936 and 1972, both of which were held in Munich, Germany. I'm sorry, Berlin and then Munich. Yes, it's of course. And then his 2000 opus is called Berlin, and it's on that great city. David currently lives in the Bay Area, where he serves as senior fellow at UC Berkeley's Institute of Foreign Studies and as a professor of history at the Fromm Institute at the University of San Francisco. Thank you, David, very much for being with us tonight. I'm very excited that you can be here.
Thanks a lot, Bradley, for that introduction. I do know something about the graying of Montana, but I won't talk about that. No, thanks a lot for the introduction, and again, thanks to all of you for coming out and paying $10 to hear me talk. I hope you won't be demanding a rebate afterwards. And finally, many thanks to the Wheeler Center Board for inviting me to speak under the aegis of an institution that really is so important for Montana in terms of promoting our understanding of important social and cultural and political issues of our day. At the risk of presumption, I think I can say that the lecture topic I've got for tonight, namely populist politics in contemporary Europe, belongs in that category of crucial issues, and crucial not just for Europeans. We'll have more to we can, I think, have more to say about that in the questions and answers. The motto for my lecture tonight might be a phrase from George Orwell, who said, "Public opinion is no more innately wise than humans are innately kind." These days, populism seems to be on the rise just about everywhere. But just what is this political phenomenon known as populism that seems so omnipresent? Populism's very diffusion around the world makes it hard to pin down conceptually, the intellectual equivalent of nailing Jell-O to the wall. That said, I think we'd all probably agree that populists like to attack entrenched elites in the name of defending the little guy, right? The marginalized, the left out. But of course, virtually all politicians do that these days. I mean, they all claim that they're defending the little guy, whether or not they belong to the elites themselves or not. In the United States, every politician runs against Washington, including those who have lived in Washington for their entire lives. Trying to achieve some conceptual clarity on this issue, the political scientist from Princeton, Jan Werner Müller, argues that contemporary populism, in addition to being anti-elite and pro-little guy, is fundamentally anti-pluralist. Crucially, populist leaders invariably claim that they, and they alone, represent the people, the true people, the real people. Populist leaders and their parties transform democracy from an instrument for inclusion into an instrument of exclusion. Now, there are admittedly notable variations within this typology. There's a left-oriented populism that focuses largely on class, grievances, and social iniquities. And there's a rightward-leaning populism that, in addition to socioeconomic grievances, highlights ethnicity, race, and threatened national status. Populism of all kinds, argues Müller, threatens democracy, because working democracy requires a pluralistic understanding that all parts of the body politic deserve fair and equal treatment. While I essentially agree with Müller on this assessment, I also believe that the issues raised by populism, the populist movements, are real and serious and deserve attention from elites that in past times they have not really gotten. Now, it so happens that in today's world, it's the right populist variant that is gaining most traction, no question about that. It's gaining most traction and gaining it nowhere more prominently than in Europe, including the western parts of that region where since World War II, liberal democracy, with varying degrees of efficiency, seemed firmly ensconced. In tonight's lecture, I'm going to try to get a handle on this efflorescence of right populism in Western Europe by focusing on developments in 5 countries: France, Germany, Austria, Italy, and Britain. Now, I know that many Brits don't consider themselves European, but for the purposes of tonight's lecture, I'm just going to make them so. I'm aware, too, that by concentrating on just these 5 countries, I'm neglecting other hotbeds of contemporary Western European populism in places like the Netherlands, for example, or Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Sweden most recently. Not to mention, of course, those nations in East Central Europe where rightist populism actually rules today, most notably Poland, Hungary, and to some degree, Slovakia. I'm limiting the number of national case studies I discuss because I'm going to take an historical approach to this question, and I'm going to deploy a fair amount of detail. If I were to try to cover all the populist cases in Europe in detail, I'd probably end up like poor Alban Barkley, Harry Truman's vice president, who fell dead at the rostrum mid-speech, having already gone on too long. Some amount of detail is necessary here because my central argument is that today's West European populism is part of an historical continuum with roots in the early post-World War II period. familiarity with the issues that, that gave rise to the populism in that time and to the appeal of populism in that period helps us understand, I think, the ingredients of contemporary populism today. Now, intriguingly for us Americans, resentment of the USA, the war's biggest winner, helped fuel populist discontent throughout Western Europe at that time, and it does still today. It's oftentimes neglected by Americans. So too, fueling populism is, of course, immigration. But immigration anxiety, which gets so much attention these days, immigration anxiety is only one part of a bundle of perceived threats to socioeconomic and political identity arising from disorienting alterations in national status on the global stage, also from Europe's epic reorganization after the war, technological renovation, changes in internal wealth distribution at home. There were, of course, some variations in the populist experience from country to country, and the 5 nations I've chosen to highlight, I think, illustrate that internal complexity. But I'll try to show that across the board, populist pressures were present from early on, present, although held in check in varying degrees by the ruling powers of the day. Thus, the phrase return of the repressed, which is actually part of the title for this talk, is meant to be understood in both the literal and the Freudian sense. Insurgent populist organizations were purposefully held under wraps, and populist impulses in the collective mindset were buried under the surface of polite discourse. To me, what is notable about this arrangement was how fragile it proved to be, how quickly those populist impulses, followed by actual populist parties, pushed back to the surface and made a place for themselves in post-war Europe's socioeconomic and political landscapes. Western Europe's current political groupings, therefore, have direct ancestors in the recent past. What we are seeing now is not some weirdness out of the blue, not some freakish upsurge easily taken care of with quick political fixes. But I'll have more to say about all of this in the conclusion. Right now, it's onto the historical nitty-gritty, starting with that special but not so special case, Great Britain. In the years after World War II, Britain, one of the war's winners in that horrific conflict, looked and felt more like a loser. Many of its major cities were severely damaged. Wartime rationing remained in place for some 5 or 6 years after the war, and the country was in deep financial hock to the USA. At war's end, Britain's global empire was still intact, but in subsequent years, it would contract to almost nothing. And that shrinking occurred with bewildering speed. Britain's erstwhile status as the Western world's leading imperial power, of course, gave way to America, which would not hesitate to rub Englishmen's noses in their newfound subordinate status. As when, for example, President Eisenhower forced the British, along with the French and the Israelis, to withdraw from their Suez adventure in 1956. By the way, right after that Suez debacle, British Prime Minister Anthony Eden fled to author Ian Fleming's Jamaica resort called Goldeneye, where he tried to soothe his wounds. Fleming, for his part, exacted revenge on the Americans by making his super sleuth James Bond much cleverer and cooler than his CIA counterpart, who had no clue that martinis are supposed to be shaken and not stirred. Britain desperately needed such Bond-style ego boosting at a time not only of imperial contraction, but also of a domestic economic recovery that did not gain much traction until the mid-50s, and which even then proved spotty and uneven, with the Midlands and the North dragging behind London and the South, still a problem today. As we know, Britain owed its gradual economic recovery in large part to America's generous Marshall Plan. But the beneficence of that Marshall Plan, that beneficence of all of that, helped fuel a larger Americanization of British society and culture that generated no small amount of resentment in proud English hearts. As a character in John Osborne's 1956 play, Look Back in Anger, says, "It's pretty dreary living in the American age, unless you're, of course, American." But it wasn't just Americanization that disturbed tradition-bound Britons in this era. Migration into the UK from its collapsing empire was running about 16,000 per year. not large by contemporary standards or later standards, but notable in that almost all of this migration was concentrated in just a few cities. Varied responses to these manifold challenges on the part of Britain's differing governments, first Labour, then Tory, never quite managed to ease the popular frustration attendant upon the country's rough passage into the new era. Recognizing that Britain could not sustain its expensive and restive imperial burden, Labour's Clement Attlee largely approved of imperial contraction, choosing instead to focus on domestic socioeconomic ills such as inadequate housing, poor health care, high unemployment, and chaotic transport. But given Britain's dire financial predicament, Labour's social welfare measures could be funded only through much higher taxes on the middle and upper classes, and also with the severe austerity in other parts of the budget, engendering a climate of overall shabbiness. When London hosted the 1948 Olympic Games, something that interests me, it was interesting that the conditions were so bare bones, so nasty, that the American team elected to stay on the ship that brought them over rather than in the Quonset huts that the organizers were going to provide for them. Believing that Britain needed to strengthen political and economic ties to the continent in order to facilitate its recovery, Attlee reached out to France in 1947 with the Treaty of Dunkirk, which in part was meant to make up for the British Army's abandonment of the continent via that port famously back in June of 1940. Here is a David Lowe cartoon of Bevan, the British foreign minister, wading to shore with a lot of goodies for his French counterpart, Georges Bidault. And this is meant to be a satire, of course, on the helplessness and hopelessness of the French, which was the British perspective at the time. Attlee discovered quickly to his dismay that cooperation with the continent was not at all popular at home, bringing in, as it did, unwanted foreign products and fashions from the continent. The poet Philip Larkin said he knew England was done for when croissants reached Yorkshire. Even more controversial and unpopular was the Attlee government's inclusion of recent migrants from Britain's colonies in the welfare in his country's generous welfare programs. Expressing a combination of welfare chauvinism, anti-tax sentiment, and imperial nostalgia, the British electorate in October 1951 exchanged Attlee for its old wartime leader, Winston Churchill, who promised to repair a tattered national identity, to put the great back in Great Britain, as he put it. But it turned out that while Churchill's policies and those of his immediate Tory successors were more closely attuned to entrenched attitudes than those of Attlee's, they were not sufficient to prevent an upsurge of nativist populist protest that lasted well into the 1960s. Churchill himself was circumscribed in what he could do by dint of the new political realities at home and abroad. The Prime Minister, having once said of Britain's old nemesis, the Germans, that they were, quote, either at your feet or at your throat, would surely have liked to cater to his countrymen's desire to keep Jerry under English feet for good. However, preventing Germany's economic revival would have necessitated using taxpayers' funds to keep the Krauts in their occupation zone housed and fed, something that simply was not on for the British. I'll be damned if I'll be tied to a dead German, said Churchill. Moreover, with regard to Western Germany, it was the Yanks who were calling the shots, not the Brits. And with the Cold War settling in, Washington demanded that the Germans in the Western occupation zones be given the wherewithal to rebuild their shattered economy and industrial infrastructure so they could support themselves and pay for themselves. West Germany was accordingly included in the Marshall Plan. And soon enough, that country was indeed on the rise. Soon, in fact, looking more like a winner than Britain itself. What the hell did we fight the bloody war for? Asked many a Brit. On the question of immigration to Britain, especially from the UK's colored former colonies, Churchill was also unable to hew as close to a protectionist nativist stance as he would have liked. In 1952, he set up an inquiry to see how further immigration by colored peoples could be prevented and whether such migrants could be kept out of the civil service. When the report proposed no restrictions, Churchill warned, and here I'm quoting, "Immigration by colored people will soon come to be resented by large sections of the British populace." Well, he was certainly right about that. and rising popular antagonism to non-white immigration led to the passage later on of a series of controls on non-European immigration. These began with the Commonwealth Immigration Act of 1962, which required employment vouchers for newcomers, especially if they were colored. Significantly enough, however, the British government's efforts then and later to impose curbs on non-white immigration were dismissed as quite ineffectual by a bevy of new hyper-nationalist organizations which commanded considerable attention and influence on the political stage in Britain at the time. Today's right populist movement in Britain, most notably the UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party under Nigel Farage, acknowledges as one of its post-war progenitors the League of Empire Loyalists, founded in 1954 by A.K. Chesterton. As a pressure group rather than a political party, the League did not contest elections. Yet because some of its members found this approach too timid, the group quickly sired more radical splinter outfits, such as the White Defence League and the National Labour Party, which merged in 1960 to form the British National Party, henceforth a mainstay on the populist right. This new organization not only fought elections, but held boisterous rallies like an infamous one in Trafalgar Square in 1962 that ended in a full-blown race riot. There is a slide of the race riot at Trafalgar Square in 1962. It was quite the thing. Now, the most prominent personality in right populist British politics of the 1960s was not a member of the BNP, but a renegade Tory, Enoch Powell. How many of you remember Enoch Powell? A few, good. He's not a name that that most people remember these days, but he was very important in his day. I would say he was the key figure in the far right situation in Britain from, say, between Oswald Mosley, who was head of the British Union of Fascists in the 30s, and today's Nigel Farage. Like Farage, Powell combined the two central fixations of today's populist mindset in Britain, namely hostility to immigration, especially colored immigration, and opposition to the UK's membership in supranational organizations like the European Union. Powell expressed his nativist worldview most forcefully and apocalyptically in his famous River of Blood speech at a Conservative Party rally on April 20th, 1968 in Birmingham. Here, the frustrated Tory castigated national immigration policies that were, he said, making indigenous Britons, I'm quoting him, feel like strangers in their own land. These policies were, he went on, making it impossible for English women to find hospital beds for childbirth or places in schools for their children. Floods of migrants, he said, were changing British neighborhoods beyond recognition and defeating the plans and prospects of native-born Britons for their future. He concluded his Jeremiad with a sinister reference to ancient Rome. As I look ahead, he said, I'm filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood. Here is a slide. There it is, the River of Blood speech from Enoch Powell. Now, Powell's speech occasioned such an outcry that the Conservative Party leader, Edward Heath, removed him from his shadow cabinet. Yet Powell's peroration undeniably struck a very prominent popular chord, and it may well be that it was a major factor in the Conservative Party's surprise win in the 1970 general election. The speech unquestionably fueled a wave of Paki bashing that roiled British streets in the 1970s. British rocker Eric Clapton notoriously did his part to fuel the flames by speaking out against immigration at a concert in 1976. Britain was in danger of becoming a black colony, Clapton shouted from the stage. Keep Britain white. Get the wogs out, keep the coons out, keep Britain white. I used to be into dope, now I'm into racism. It's much heavier, man. That's Eric Clapton. You wouldn't have thought it, right? He later recanted that. So that sentiment no longer espoused personally by Clapton, is very much in evidence in today's Britain, post-Brexit referendum. The success of the Leave campaign may have reduced the clout of UKIP, but it has given new impetus to white nationalists and xenophobes who feel empowered now to spout racist slogans and to translate their prejudices into attacks on foreign migrants of all sorts, even those from within the EU. Now we have Polish bashing along with Paki bashing. It's not quite Powell's River of Blood, but it's getting there. Britain, the scene, I was just there, the scene is quite ugly right now in Britain, especially northern Britain. On to France. In principle, France, like Britain, was among the victors of World War II, of course. French resistors to the Nazi occupation claimed to have played a huge role, a decisive role, in fact, in the liberation of their country in the summer of 1944 and in the final victory in the spring of 45. A representative of Free France was present at Germany's surrender in the West, which was surprising to the Germans. The French here too, said the general. And France managed, of course, to garner an occupation zone of its own in vanquished Germany. But in the post-war era, France also had to contend with lingering humiliation, severe humiliation, over the nation's disastrous defeat in 1940 and the terrible shame of Vichy, that short-lived regime under Marshal Pétain that had extensively collaborated with the Germans. Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French in exile, and then the head of the Provisional France after the liberation, continued to seethe with resentment over the condescending treatment he'd received from Churchill, and especially FDR, during the war. FDR despised de Gaulle, by the way, considering him an incipient dictator. At FDR's insistence, de Gaulle's Free French were largely excluded from the D-Day invasion and also kept away from the crucial Yalta summit with Stalin in the summer of 1945. Protecting the volatile new French Fourth Republic from domination by the Anglo-Saxons was one of de Gaulle's primary goals after the war. But the general angrily withdrew from the political scene in 1946 when the new parliament refused to give him the powers he wanted, and the unstable governmental coalitions of the Fourth Republic proved unable to prevent the Americans from reviving and then rearming West Germany, something most French people deeply feared and strongly opposed. At the same time, France experienced another jolt to its self-confidence and self-image through the loss of its overseas empire, which in some notable cases, such as Indochina and Algeria, proved to be much bloodier and more divisive affairs than Britain's retreat from empire. But in France, as in Britain, the loss of empire was psychologically significant because possession of colonies served as a kind of balm for the sufferings and humiliations of the war. And in France, even more than in Britain, embittered ex-colonialists returning to the motherland constituted a crucial reservoir of support for early populist movements. This would continue through the years, with the Pied Noir diaspora of Algerian whites in southern France eventually providing huge support for the National Front under Jean-Marie Le Pen. Along with bitterness over decolonization, France's financial dependence on the USA and fears of a possible erosion of French identity in the face of spreading American cultural influence fueled inward-looking defensiveness from early on. Even the Marshall Plan proved controversial in France. A poll in July 1947 showed that only 38% of adults believed that this initiative did not constitute a serious threat to French sovereignty. Influential intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre warned of France being inundated by an alien culture, and a stupid culture at that, he said. Going further, Le Monde editorialized in 1949 about the dangers of an American political culture that, and here I quote, which attacks the very roots of the mental and moral cohesion of the people of Europe, unquote. The paper singled out Coca-Cola as an especially insidious force. Not only did the sickly sweet beverage rot one's teeth and brain, but its bottlers would, and here I quote, do double duty as a US espionage network. No wonder many Frenchmen readily believed a rumor that Coke planned to put its logo atop the Eiffel Tower. No wonder, too, that a coalition of communist militants and wine growers managed to obstruct the marketing of Coca-Cola in France for many, many years. Opposition to Coca-Cola, of course, was based partly on economics. And economic issues, along with anguish over France's depleted status on the global scene, propelled the growth of proto-populist sentiment. France's economic recovery and reconstruction during the Fourth Republic depended not only on assistance from outside, but, as in Britain, on heavy taxation and extensive regulatory control from the central government in Paris, whose agencies were staffed with bright young technocrats from the Grandes Écoles. It was these technocrats, starting with Jean Monnet, who sought to modernize France by directing public and private investment into the economy's most dynamic and nimble segments. Although the various Monet plans did yield impressive advances in industrial and technological productivity, they tended to leave behind an entrenched, static France, consisting primarily of family farmers, small shopkeepers, artisans, and students in the humanities, all of whom continued to insist that balance and harmony were higher virtues than modernization and growth. They attacked the modernizers as sorcerers' apprentices, thoughtlessly resisting or releasing forces of mechanization and internationalization that would destroy old France. Their representatives in the National Assembly tried to scotch a key part of Monet's modernization plan, namely the European Coal and Steel Community of 1951, which facilitated trade in those resources between France, West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. This institution eventually provided the blueprint for the common market, inaugurated 5 years later. Although the common market, like the coal and steel community, was primarily a French inspiration and covered mainly just trade, it provoked considerable anxiety among rural French conservative legislators who feared it would both hurt their economic interests and corrupt national morals. They feared that a united Europe would eventually amount to little more than an enlarged Germany, which is something that contemporary French populists also complain about and rail about. The French central government's inability or unwillingness to shelter old France, la France profonde, from the winds of economic and cultural change prompted the establishment of post-war France's first recognizably populist political organization, the anti-tax, anti-Anglo-Saxon, anti-common market party led by a provincial shopkeeper named Pierre Poujade. Poujad's initial target in 54-55 was France's unusually audacious prime minister of that day, a modernizer of Jewish descent named Pierre Mendès France, who not only negotiated the loss of Indochina, but tried unsuccessfully to fight alcoholism in France by pushing the French people to drink milk rather than wine. Didn't work. Churchill thought it was odd too. In January 1955, Poujade brought 100,000 anti-government militants to Paris to rally against Mendès France, whom Poujade accused of betraying the country abroad and at home through imperial retreat, oppressive taxes, mindless modernization, and backing down to the Americans on reviving the terrible Boche. Here is a slide of some Poujadists in 1955 in Paris. They look like they're having a good time. Although the Poujade movement soon fell victim to internal backstabbing and division, Poujade himself established a template for modern French populism in his claims to be on the side, and here I'm quoting him, the little man, the trashed, the ripped off, the humiliated against the vampire state. And while denouncing graduates of the École Polytechnique as the main culprits in the woes of the 1950s, Poujade boasted of never having read a book. He touted himself also as a paragon of family values, in contrast to the National Assembly, which he denounced as the biggest brothel in Paris. And finally, to fill out his credentials as a full-on populist demagogue, he condemned the government's acceptance of non-white immigrants into France as an existential danger to the nation's social fabric. He advocated expelling immigrants not only from France, but from the entire common market. Now, to be fair to Poujade, I should note that in his last days, just before he died, as his erstwhile protege Jean-Marie Le Pen rose to prominence and ran for president in 2002, the old man denounced Le Pen as a fraud and a liar, confessing that launching this man's political career had been the worst thing he'd ever done in his life. Le Pen, Jean-Marie Le Pen, for his part, faulted Poujade for lacking a killer political instinct and for failing to understand that international Jewry, along with foreign immigrants, was inimical to the interests of true France. Le Pen would not make those mistakes himself. He ran his party with an iron hand, and he made anti-Semitism central to his political platform, insisting in a major speech that, here I quote, "the Jews have conspired to rule the world." Essentially a Holocaust denier, Le Pen famously dismissed the Nazi gas chambers as a mere detail in recent history, and privately referred to Hitler as Uncle Dolphy. This was a significant turn in French right populism, which had earlier staunchly condemned the Third Reich and opposed any revival of German resources. Le Pen's daughter, Marina, who seized power from her ailing papa. I think I have a picture of him. Maybe I should show that first. There he is. There's Le Pen in full voice, denouncing the Jews and others as dangers to true France. Le Pen's daughter, Marina, who seized power from her father in 2011, distanced the National Front from anti-Semitism while holding fast to the group's claim to represent the left-behind victims of increased European unification, Anglo-Saxon cultural imperialism, globalization, and last but hardly least, an influx of Muslim immigrants whose prodigious demographic expansion and growing social and cultural presence threatened to bring what she called an Islamicization of Europe. Once a year, Marine Le Pen would lead a rally at the Jeanne d'Arc statue in central Paris, putting herself forward as France's new Joan of Arc. There she is, right in front of the statue, claiming to be France's new savior, new Joan. And it's interesting, you remember Joan fought against the British. So there's that element here as well. While Marine Le Pen's campaigns to win the French presidency failed, she pushed, and this is very important, she pushed mainstream French conservatism far to the right as it fought to take the wind out of the sails of French populism. In 2011, President Nicolas Sarkozy fired his diversity minister, declared that multiculturalism had been a failure, and promised to stage a public debate on Islam. Not long thereafter, another French president, François Hollande, a socialist, took a similar tack, approving bans on the wearing of burqas, hijabs, and burkinis. This catering to populist sentiment did not improve Hollande's historically low standing with the French public, and his weakness was emblematic of a huge slump for social democratic parties across Europe. This is one of the most important facets of contemporary European politics. The decline of the moderate left is essentially gone. All right, let's move on to Germany. In post-war Britain and France, vestiges of outright fascism were held firmly in check, but flag-waving patriotism was officially encouraged as a force for fending off threats to national identity and sovereignty. In vanquished Germany, by contrast, public expressions of patriotic nationalism were practically taboo, verboten. In Western Germany, which is the part of Germany I want to talk about now, the natives were encouraged by the Western allies and their own leaders to remake themselves as overnight devotees of a kind of nationless, free market constitutional democracy. With the American occupiers taking the lead in this enterprise, Americanization found huge traction in the region, gaining enormous influence, not only in politics, but in culture and economics. No country was more Americanized than West Germany. Coca-Cola, once again, that bête noire beverage in France, swept across Deutschland faster than anywhere else. Former boxer Max Schmeling, victor over Joe Louis for the heavyweight championship in 1936, became in 1960s a champion Coke bottler, owning West Germany's largest bottling facility. A little known fact for conversation. But it was precisely Coca-Cola, the Coca-Colization of West Germany, this rapid spread of American products and manners and fads that prompted a backlash on the intellectual front, with writers like Ernst von Sollemann, Stefan Heim, and Wolfgang Köppen decrying the American occupiers as brutal and barbarous, and US culture as a dangerous drug. At the same time, the American push for denazification and democratization in the immediate post-war period generated swirling undercurrents of resentment and anger. Although officially repressed by the authorities, these subversive currents kept bubbling to the surface. For example, Wehrmacht veterans and some former Nazis, embittered over the strict demilitarization and denazification procedures, flocked in 1949 to a neo-Nazi group calling itself the Sozialistische Reichspartei, or the Socialist Party of the Reich. This outfit castigated newly elected West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer as a puppet of the Allies, protested the incarceration of Wehrmacht officers for war crimes, and publicly disputed Hitler's mass murder of the Jews, although privately, after a few beers, these guys typically complained that the Holocaust hadn't gone far enough. In 1951, the SRP won 11% of the vote in the Landtag of Lower Saxony. That's actually a lot because of Germany's fragmented political scene. Alarmed over this development, Adenauer's government banned the Reichspartei in 1952. Meanwhile, ethnic German expellees from the former German territories in Eastern Europe constituted another repository of Völkisch nationalism, one less openly neo-Nazi and therefore not readily bannable. A party of expellees and the disenfranchised party won 23% of the Landtag vote in Schleswig-Holstein in 1950. Here's a rally of these expellees who would come from Poland and from Czechoslovakia and so forth, Ukraine, demanding that they be heard and that their lands be returned to them. They still constitute a very important, their heirs still constitute a very important part in German politics, especially in Bavaria. There's still a party of expellees. Politically sensitive to the grievances of folks like this, Konrad Adenauer took care to avoid direct criticisms of Germany's Nazi past and tried to curry favor with unrepentant nationalists by chastising the Allies for harping on this dimension of the German heritage. Even General Eisenhower was brought to declare that he had been wrong to conflate the Wehrmacht with the Nazis. The German soldier fought bravely and honorably for his fatherland, Eichmann now was made to concede. More significantly, Adenauer successfully made Bonn's regaining control over its foreign policy the price for his country's rearmament and joining NATO in 1955. West Germany was distinctive in that it alone stood to recover its sovereignty by joining international organizations. In effect, post-war Germans could be German only by being European. Not surprisingly, this pressure to put supranationalism over nationalism, resented by some at the very beginning, would over time attract ever more adherents to the politics of nationalist resentment and backlash, very prominent today. For the time being, though, safely integrated into the Western Atlantic world and embarked on a near miraculous economic recovery that earned the sobriquet Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, West Germany no longer seemed fertile ground for populist discontent. Yet the very success of the region's economic revival harbored the impetus for ethnic nationalist anger down the road. It turned out that the country's growing export industry could expand only with the importation of foreign workers, since the domestic workforce was far too small. So via agreement starting in the mid-50s, the Adenauer government began importing so-called Gastarbeiter, guest workers, from Italy, Greece, Morocco, Tunisia, and most numerously, eventually and faithfully, Turkey. According to the original plan, these workers were supposed to stay for only a short period and then return home when their contracts expired. Many of them, however, especially the Turks, stayed on and then brought their families along over. The Turks settled in so assiduously that little Ankaras started sprouting up in West German cities, most notably in West Berlin, in Neukölln and Kreuzberg. This is a recent picture, kind of a satire on the Turks in Neukölln, which is a part of Berlin. I'm Muslim, don't panic. There's a special story about the Turks. I don't have time to go into it. It's a fascinating story of their position right now in Germany. But in the 50s, they settled in and they became a real presence on the scene. And this really began to bother a lot of Germans. There were some, of course, Germans who welcomed the infusion of foreign culture and food, colorful bit of ethnic window dressing, shish kebab, and so forth. But many others complained of Überfremdung, being sort of over-foreignized, foreigners taking over the country, hogging jobs and housing, they said, school places, and making German towns unrecognizable. A major exploiter of this rising discontent was a new right populist party calling itself the Nationalist Party of Germany, the NPD. It's a little blurry, I'm afraid, but there they are. You can see them, the NPD. This group demanded immediate repatriation of foreign workers and their families, abandonment of NATO, and the regaining of ethnic German territories lost in the post-World War II settlement. Although this NPD never gained enough votes to get into the Bundestag, it managed to crack several state parliaments, including Bavaria, Hesse, and Lower Saxony. The party's biggest gains came in the mid-1960s, when it profited from a sudden economic downturn, widespread backlash against leftist student activism, the famous '68 rebellions, and above all, a new grand coalition in Bonn. which, by combining the mainstream conservative and moderate left parties, created a void on the fringes, one readily exploited by the NPD. The same exact thing is happening today, 50 years later, during Angela Merkel's extended grand coalition with the SPD, which opened space for the upstart alternative party of Germany, the AfD. More about that in a second. Although there were numerous attempts to ban this NPD as a threat to the constitutional order, these never succeeded because the group in question was not deemed a significant enough danger by Germany's constitutional watchdog agency. Yet the NPD's continued existence on the far right of the Bond's political spectrum did pose enough of a threat to the traditional conservatives that, as in France, they moved further to the right themselves to avoid losing voters on the fringe. The chief of Bavaria's Christian Social Union, CSU, Franz Josef Strauss, famously insisted that his party must never be overtaken by a party on the right. This kind of thinking did not remain the exclusive trademark of Strauss. It would come to define the strategy of today's CSU, Christian Social Union, in the face of a new, much more potent right populist threat from the aforementioned AfD. Here's an AfD demo. Now, just a few words about this AfD. Some of my Germans call it Arschlöcher for Deutschland, which means assholes for Germany, which it looms very large on the United Germany's political. It now polls at about 17%, which is really high. The AfD, as you may know, didn't originate as a populist party. Rather, it began as a motley collection of free market economists, business people, and conservatives who urged abandoning the euro and a return to the Deutschmark, that icon of West German economic prosperity. These folks also complained about Angela Merkel's commitment of German taxpayer money to the bailout of insolvent Greece in 2013. But 2 years later, following Merkel's fateful decision to admit 1 million asylum seekers, mostly Muslim, the party shifted direction, making anti-immigration its chief calling card. Yet the migration issue was by no means the only arrow in the AfD's quiver. Channeling the NPD, it eagerly embraced Blut und Boden, or blood and soil nationalism, along with demands that Germany abandon its atonement for the Holocaust and take full pride in its ethnic heritage. In its conversion to full-on right populism, the party ousted some of its earlier leadership and elevated strident nationalist tub thumpers like Alexander Gauland and Bjorn Höcke. Here is Höcke's. Höcke's now taken over the AfD, basically. Höcke, and this is the Nazi salute that these guys are doing. Previously completely forbidden in Germany, but now very much present. Gauland dismissed the whole National Socialist period as nothing but a bunch of Vogelschiss, or bird shit. Some bird, I'd say. But anyway, that's the mentality you have now in the AfD. Capitalizing on these leaders' demagogical skills, especially their willingness to instrumentalize crimes committed by asylum seekers and other migrants, the AfD broke into the Bundestag in the federal elections of September 2017, winning nearly 13% of the vote. Emboldened by this achievement, Gauland promised, quote, to take back our country and our people, unquote. Like the November 1916 election in America, the 2017 Bundestag election result was a sobering wake-up call for those many Germans who believed that pluralistic democracy and Merkel's welcome culture constituted an unassailable moral compass for their modern reunified country. In response to the palpable AfD threat, Merkel would spend the following year grudgingly walking back Berlin's liberal policies on immigration. They're quite strict now. It so happens that in those same 2017 elections, the AfD performed almost as well in Bavaria as it did in the East, where it performed strongest. A startling development not lost on Bavaria's CSU or Bavarian colleagues in that state. Fearing a real possibility of being overtaken on the right by an upstart party, the elections are next month, Horst Seehofer, the chief of the CSU and the interior minister in Merkel's cabinet, insisted that the chancellor adopt ever harsher restrictions on immigration or face abandonment by her Bavarian partners, and thus the wrecking of the entire governmental coalition. Democratic Germany seemed in danger of imploding, this just a month or so ago. Looking in on this sad spectacle, Germany's EU allies, especially France's Emmanuel Macron, had to wonder what had happened to Paris's once reliable partner in the Europeanization of Europe. Gauland answered that question in one phrase. We Germans have become German again, he said. All right, on to Austria. Just two more, not to worry. We'll get there. As in Germany, the evolution, nature, and prominence of right-wing populism in Austria had much to do with the country's National Socialist past and post-war history. But the Austrian case is rather different from Germany's because the little Alpine Republic evolved its own separate way of contending with its Nazi heritage, of establishing a new national identity, and of crafting a special place for itself in the post-World War II period. By stoutly denying any co-responsibility for Nazi criminality, while under the surface retaining significant aspects of proto-Nazi sentiment, the Austrian Second Republic fostered the development of a far-right fringe culture that was actually much stronger and more influential than Germany's. This helps explain why a far-right populist party currently occupies a place in Vienna's central government, and this for the third time since 1945. In historical fact, Austria's citizens and German citizens of Austrian birth, like Hitler himself, played a very prominent role in the Nazi drama. But in the post-war era, the new Austrian nation was able to dodge historical and legal responsibility for this reality by casting itself as a victim of Nazism rather than as a co-conspirator. The Allied powers, hoping to split Austria off from Germany, crucially gave early credence to this fable in 1943 by officially declaring Austria, and here I quote, the first country to fall victim to Hitlerite aggression. This was the Moscow Declaration of 1953. This declaration was referring to the Anschluss of 1938, when German troops did invade Austria, but without any significant resistance, and in the wake of which native son Hitler got a rapturous welcome in Vienna's Heldenplatz. There he is, the boy coming home. Actually, he hated Vienna, but in any event, Austria was very much complicit in the Anschluss and in later crimes. This first victim narrative became absolutely central to Austria's post-war political identity, allowing it to avoid paying restitution to Israel in the 1950s, as West Germany did, or returning stolen property to Jews, as West Germans also did, however, reluctantly and selectively. Meanwhile, the first post-war Republican government, a coalition of the Austrian Socialist Party, SPÖ, and the conservative Austrian People's Party, eagerly integrated former Nazis into the democratic social order. Most ex-Nazis joined one of the two mainstream parties, but the more hardcore among them formed their own party, called the League of Independents, which in 1956 morphed into the Freedom Party, the very group now sharing power in Vienna with the Conservative People's Party. Austria's leaders carried the narrative of their people's non-culpability for Third Reich criminality into negotiations surrounding the 1955 State Treaty, which established Austria as a neutral independent state, free of Allied occupation. On Soviet insistence, the original preamble to that treaty had contained a clause positing Austrian co-responsibility with Germany for Nazi-era transgressions, but Austrian Foreign Minister Leopold Figl managed to get this clause removed at the last minute. Some 10 years later, in 1965, Vienna witnessed an outbreak of ugly street violence that perhaps had the potential to ignite a serious debate about Austria's Nazi past and echoes of that past in the present. The violence in question erupted over the actions of an unrepentant former Nazi professor, one Taras Borodajkowicz, who frequently spouted anti-Semitic and pro-Hitler commentary in his lectures. Borodajkowicz refused to recant or resign when called to account for his behavior. On the contrary, he doubled down in his taunting rhetoric. Members of the Socialist Party student organization took to the streets to protest against this professor. Here you see Borodajkowicz, Vergifter der Jugend, poisoner of youth. This is the socialist demonstration. So right there on the elegant Ringstrasse, these socialist students clashed with members of the Freedom Party's own student group who arrived with baseball bats and signs saying, "Long live Auschwitz." During the melee, a Freedom Party thug beat to death a leftist demonstrator, for which crime he received a 10-month jail sentence. Alas, because the Socialist Party leadership elected not to put this case forward as a reason for national soul-searching, no such conversation took place. By the way, I happened to be present for this demo in Austria at the time because I was studying at the University of Vienna. But I can't say I was part of the action. I merely observed it from the comfort of a nearby coffee house. I didn't want to plunge into it. In that same period in Vienna, I was also witness to quite another revealing demonstration, I think, of post-war Austrian attitudes and values. This very different. In 1965, I'm sure you know the film Sound of Music, right? This famous play then made into a film. Well, The Sound of Music arrived in Vienna at a cinema near my apartment in 65. And it stayed there for months on end, playing to packed houses every night. The reason for this huge popularity is that the film, which was based on a true story, although highly embellished, catered perfectly to the Austrian self-image as victims of Nazi aggression. When not filling the hills around Salzburg with their cheerful singing, the Doughty von Trapps registered stout opposition to the German Nazi intruders, resulting in their having to flee Austria via a heroic march over the mountains to Switzerland. In reality, they took a train to Italy. Although the Salzburg region continues today to celebrate the von Trapp story in order to burnish a legend of opposition to Nazi aggression, the place in reality was a veritable nest of Nazism, the hills filled with the sound of the Horst Wessel Lied, the Nazi marching song. In 1970, Austria seemed to have turned an important corner with respect both to its Nazi past and ongoing political orientation. For the first time in history, the Austrian Republic elected a Jew as chancellor and a socialist Jew as that, Bruno Kreisky. But Kreisky was careful to play down his Jewish ancestry and his wartime past as a refugee from Nazism. And in fact, he came to power via the toleration of that right-wing Freedom Party, for whose assistance he rewarded the far right by appointing 4 former Nazis to his cabinet. When the famed Viennese Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal called Kreisky out on his personnel policy, the chancellor denounced Wiesenthal as a Jewish fascist. Kreisky went on to do some good things for Austria. He brought many international organizations to Vienna, including OPEC. But one thing he never did was question Austria's first victim narrative. On the contrary, the fact that from 1970 to 1983, Austria had a Jewish chancellor was held up as proof that the country had no need for critical self-reflection regarding its past. No real need either to address the ongoing influence of nativist attitudes in Austrian politics. That situation might have continued completely unimpeded or uninterrupted had it not been for a quite unexpected international controversy in 1986 engulfing the Conservative Party's candidate for President one, Kurt Waldheim. I'm sure most of you have heard of Kurt. I don't have time to take you here through the whole intricacy of this issue. Suffice it to think of the Waldheim story as the sound of music in reverse. The hills of Austria now seeming to echo with a sound not of cheerful folk songs, but of Nazi slogans. The crucial moment came when the presidential candidate Waldheim, who was accused by American Jewish critics of lying about his past as a Wehrmacht officer and involved in atrocities, labeled that criticism against him as an attack against all of Austria, which in fact it duly became. Now, all of a sudden, the little Alpine country became a focal point of international scrutiny, and emphatically not as the land of Mozart and Lippenzahner horses and Sachertorte mit Schlag, but as something quite different. And how could this not have been the case when Waldheim himself brazenly claimed the moral high ground for Austria in its confrontation with his Jewish critics? Yes, the Jews have suffered, he said, but so too have we Austrians. But we have learned the virtues of tolerance and reconciliation. Deftly exploiting the foreign opposition to his candidacy, Waldheim went on to win his election in a landslide. Now more than ever was the winning slogan. Erst jetzt recht. Here's, we Austrians vote for whom we want. Now we want Waldheim more than ever. Jetzt erst recht. So he fans the flames of resistance to outside pressure and a kind of local nativism to win the presidency. In the long run, though, and this is important, I think a more significant consequence of this whole messy business is that Waldheim's nativist campaign and selective memory, which The Economist magazine mocked as Waldheimer's disease, ended up causing genuine distress as well as approval at home. Even more importantly, this distress segued into larger internal debates in Austria about that country's role in the entire Nazi enterprise. Believe me, no one was happier about this turn of events than the Germans. Long aggrieved over Austria's apparent success in making the rest of the world think that Beethoven was an Austrian and Hitler was a native German. Whereas in Germany, the period of the Waldheim affair, the mid-1980s to the early 1990s, was marked by a growing elite consensus regarding the necessity of contrition for Nazi crimes. In Austria, domestic battles over Waldheim polarized the entire nation, with conservatives and their media supporters trying to hold the line against what they called muckraking, masochistic muckraking, while an anti-Waldheim faction, consisting mainly of leftists, sharply attacked the still entrenched narrative of victimization regarding Austria's past. Crucially, at the beginning of the 1990s, the mainstream Socialist Party got on the contrition wagon, and finally, in 1991, the new socialist chancellor, Franz Vranitzky, formally recognized Austrian complicity in the Holocaust. The chancellor clearly understood that this admission was a precondition for Austria's joining the European Union, which it did in 1995. Not surprisingly, given the ongoing influence of Austria's victim narrative, Vranitzky's actions prompted a powerful backlash. The chief profiteer of this backlash was the Freedom Party, which gained huge support in the 1990s under their new leader, Jörg Haider, another name you may be familiar with. Herr Haider, a media-savvy rabble-rouser from the sticks who looked good in lederhosen, proved very adept at tapping the darkest recesses of the Austrian psyche. Unfortunately, I couldn't get him in lederhosen. Trust me, he did wear them. But here he is in Austrian Tracht, that is the traditional garb. Far from expressing remorse over Nazi crimes, Haider praised Nazi policies, most notably Hitler's full employment program. He also exploited growing nativist sentiment against migrants, especially those from the Middle East. Muslim Turks had stood at the gates of Vienna in 1683. Now, cried Haider, militant Islam was assaulting Christian Europe once again. In 2000, Haider's party, though not Haider himself, joined a coalition with the People's Party under Chancellor Wolfgang Schüssel. The EU responded by imposing mild sanctions against Austria, but undaunted in that same year, Schüssel used the occasion of a marking of the Nazi Night of the Crystals to restate the old Austrian myth of victimhood. The Germans took Austria by force as their first victims, he said. Now, some 18 years later, Austria is once again ruled by a Freedom Party, People's Party coalition, and for the next few months, Vienna will be in control of the revolving presidency of the European Union. Austria is therefore in a position to exert its victim-inflected influence on the EU as never before. In alliance with Hungary's Viktor Orban, Vienna's brash young conservative chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, has already laid out what Austria's stance should be. Strict new limits on immigration, rapid expulsion of most asylum seekers, and a virtual shutdown of Europe's southeastern border. And if it is up to Kurz's deputy chancellor, the Freedom Party's own Hans Christian Strache, Austria will also take lead in efforts to weaken the EU from inside. After all, Strache is famous for denouncing Brussels as a bureaucratic monster, for hailing Brexit as a brilliant move for Britain, and for welcoming Vladimir Putin's input in EU affairs. Here's Strache and his Freedom Party. It would be ironic, I think, if Austria, once the center of a kind of proto-EU in the form of the multinational Habsburg monarchy, became instrumental in the destruction of post-war Europe's efforts at integration and unification. Now, do I have time for one more to move on to Italy quickly, and then we'll? Okay, all right. Let me conclude all of this with. I have to mention Italy because Italy is a very interesting case here. Italy is at present the only Western European nation, apart from Austria, to have a far-right populist party enmeshed in central power. But in Italy, we actually have two populist parties running the show. And that's the only case of this in the entire EU. More specifically, we have the five-star movement and the Northern League, now calling itself just the League, sharing an uneasy, very uneasy coalition in Rome. Although this triumph of right populism in Italy has caught many observers by surprise, to me as an historian of modern Europe, it's really not so surprising at all, given the evolution of Italian politics since 1945 and the role that right-wing populism and neo-fascism have played throughout that time. Thinking about Italy, we must remember that this was the country in which fascism originated in the early 1920s, and which, as with Austria, a fascist legacy lived on after the war within the conservative establishment, publicly repressed but privately accommodated for political gain. At the center of post-war Italy's lingering fascist legacy was the ghost of fascism's founder, Benito Mussolini, who had been executed by communist partisans on April 28, 1945. I say ghost, but for a considerable time it was Mussolini's actual body, his much abused corpse, that served as a central icon for all of this. Following his execution, Mussolini's killers suspended his body and that of his mistress, Clara Petacci, from the roof of an Esso gas station in Milan's Piazzale Loreto. Word of this display brought hundreds of gawkers to the grisly scene, some of whom made it even grislier by pummeling the dead Duce with clubs in their fists until this human piñata was barely recognizable. So, of course, I have a picture of that. There you go. There's Benito and Clara hanging upside down, beaten, pummeled. After a while, Allied authorities removed the battered corpse and buried it in an unmarked grave in a Milan cemetery. But information soon got out regarding the Duce's new resting place, which some locals had employed as a latrine. To prevent further desecration of the grave, an around-the-clock guard was posted at the site, but only for a short period. On April 28, 1946, exactly 1 year after Mussolini's execution and also an Easter Sunday, a pair of neo-fascists, besotted with love for their martyred messiah, managed to dig up Mussolini's corpse and remove it to a safe house in the hills. There it remained for some 100 days, not reburied, but propped up devotionally on a couch, a fascist fez on what remained of its rotting skull. Neighboring fascists came to pay their respects. Less respectful neighbors, however, eventually notified the authorities about this makeshift shrine, resulting in yet another transfer of the movable corpse, this time to a place guaranteed to be secure from either fascist pilgrims or leftist vandals. The new internment site was the convent of Cerro Maggiore near Milan, a location known only to a few top governmental and clerical officials. That the Duce's remains were now protected by a Catholic order made good sense, given the extent to which the Vatican had gone to harbor many living fascists after the war. Mussolini's body remained in its convent hideaway until 1957, when a conservative Christian democratic government with close ties to a neo-fascist party, the Movimento Sociale Italiano, or MSI, decided the time was right to return the remains to the Duce's family. Thus, the former fascist leader was laid to rest in the place he still resides today, a family crypt in the village of Predappio, Mussolini's birthplace. There it is. Inevitably, this site, bedecked with fascist symbols, became a pilgrimage goal. Whoops, what the hell happened? There it is, a pilgrimage goal for neo-fascists. There they are at Predappio, saluting their dead Duce. Pilgrims to the site also left devotional comments in a kind of guest book. I actually visited this site at one point, just for research purposes, of course, and collected some of these devotional comments, and I'll share one of them with you. This is from a young mother who had visited the year before I was there. And here she wrote, "As I promised you, Duce, today I have brought you my son, who is now 20 months old. Naturally, he too is a fascist. Every time I pay homage to you is a unique sensation for me. In today's world, a charismatic figure and fighter would enable us Italians to be respected and feared once again throughout the world. Please return. Make Italy great again." Had a resurrected Mussolini returned to Italy in 1946, the year his body first beat a path to the hills, he would have found a nation not yet ready for him, but not nearly as disgusted with his destructive legacy as one might have thought or hoped. The post-war Republic Italian constitution was a model of democratic pluralism, but under the surface there resided an unwillingness to thoroughly purge the past or think about why Italy in the 1920s had become the first nation of fascism. The Allies were complicit in this strategic amnesia by all too quickly abandoning an initial effort to track down and punish fascist criminals. Within a short time after the war, the winning coalition on the Italian scene, namely the Christian Democrats and their resurgent Vatican allies, made combating communism their primary objective. To that end, it was all hands on deck, including ex-fascists, many of whom did not even bother to recant their former affiliations. One of the first acts of the new parliament was to pass a general amnesty for citizens convicted of fascist-era crimes by tribunals during the first months of the war, when the American legal advisors were still focusing on the residual potency of fascism before shifting to the Red Menace. Already in 1946, the coast was clear for the emergence of a genuine neo-fascist party, the aforementioned Movimento Sociale Italiano, whose initials, people joked, really stood for Mussolini sempre immortale, Mussolini always immortal. And in fact, the MSI had no qualms about praising the dead Duce as Italy's greatest leader ever. Mussolini sempre ragione, Mussolini is always right, remained a watchword for this party, whose symbol, a trapezoid surmounted by a flame, was derived from the shape of Mussolini's first casket, on which the grave robbers had placed a lighted flame. There's the MSI. Destra means the right, the national right, and that's the flame of the MSI. Interestingly enough, the MSI's primary intellectual guru, a philosopher named Julius Evola, who had also been an advisor to Mussolini, became later a lodestar for none other than America's Stephen Bannon. He's a great admirer of Evola. The MSI in 1994 morphed into the National Alliance by pulling a number of rightist fringe groups together. In that year's election, the alliance came into a respectable third place, prompting the then Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi to include this party in his governmental coalition. This was the first time a far-right party had entered a central government in post-war Europe, and it shocked a great many people. How could Italy, the birthplace of fascism, offer a neo-fascist outfit such credibility, such influence? But Berlusconi himself thought this was no problem. He'd always admired Mussolini, and many observers saw distinct parallels between Il Duce and Il Cavaliere, namely Berlusconi. Both were media savvy. Both promoted cults of personality. Both were dictatorial and hyper-nationalistic. Both imposed laws that benefited their own careers. Both were habitual liars. Neither had any respect for traditional political institutions, and both were inveterate womanizers. Any resemblance between any other characters, we don't know about. To augment its influence in post-war Italy, Mussolini's restive ghost found a living, hyperactive heir in the person of Alessandra Mussolini, the Duce's granddaughter. There she is. A former soft porn actress and Playboy model, Alessandra brought the antics of the big screen to her political career, which she inaugurated in the early 1990s by winning a seat in the parliament as a member of the MSI. Later, when the MSI reinvented itself as the National Alliance, and under a new leader, Gianfranco Fini, began to disavow its fascist roots, Alessandra bolted from the alliance and formed her own party, Social Action. In this political iteration, Alessandra stayed true to fascism's hyper-nationalism and ethnic identity politics, while also touting progressive causes like women's rights, abortion, and civil unions. She also championed gay rights, but lapsed into fascism's ready homophobia whenever her progressive credentials were called into question. For example, when an Italian transgender activist chided her for being a fascist, she replied, "Meglio fascista che froccio," better a fascist than a faggot. In 2006, Alessandra Mussolini was elected to the European Parliament as a member of the far-right faction in Brussels, Identity, Tradition, and Sovereignty, but she managed to get her party suspended by condemning open borders in the EU, which had allowed a wave of Romanians to enter Italy. "All Romanians are criminals," she shouted. Nonetheless, Alessandra resurfaced in Italian politics by joining Berlusconi's new group, Forza Italia. And as a member of that party, she won re-election to the European Parliament in 2014, where she reigns today. She also became quite close to Berlusconi, seeing him as a timely reincarnation of her grandfather. There they are, the two of them, Silvia and Alessandra. In today's highly charged Italian political climate, Mussolini's ghost is more prominent than ever. Among the new major claimants to this legacy is Matteo Salvini of the Lega, currently Deputy Prime Minister alongside Luigi Di Maio of the Five Star. There he is. He's a really nasty creature. Very much like Austria's Hans Christian Strache in Vienna, Salvini combines demands to shut down immigration with calls to weaken European integration. And while Strache shouts Österreich über alles, Salvini echoes with primi gli Italiani, Italians above all. He currently brags that he's headed for a big bust up with Brussels. He wants to redo the whole European Union. With help from Steve Bannon, by the way, who has this group called The Movement now, centered in Brussels. All right, so let me just conclude quickly. What are we to conclude from this brief but selective look at the evolution of Western European right populism since World War II? As I hope I've made clear, the populism we see today in Western Europe has organizational roots in the first decades after the war. This was a period which a French historian labeled the Glorious 30, that is, the years between 1945 and 1975, when Western European nations enjoyed a much welcome bounty of economic growth and peace. But even in this time of relative peace and economic growth, populist sentiment rose up and gained traction. And efforts by mainstream parties to corral right populist groups by co-opting some of their programs generally failed. What these efforts did do, however, was weaken equal treatment for all, which is the central premise on which liberal democracy is based. If nothing else, the persistence of populism within Western Europe's flagship democracies over the last 70-odd years shows that this phenomenon is not likely to dry up and go away, that it is here to stay in one form or another. And with this persistence comes an ongoing challenge to democratic values and institutions. The fact is, Europe is not primarily in danger from outside threats like militant Islam. Europe is threatened mainly from within. And by this inside danger, I'm referring both to the threat of populism itself and to the efforts to contend with populism by borrowing extensively from its repertoire of illiberal ideals and practices. The question now is whether this historically rooted challenge to liberal democratic ideals can be contained in an era when once powerful forces of constraint, namely a rules-based international order, moderate centrist parties, a respected mainstream press, institutional checks and balances, and respect for scientific and expert authority, and credible employment prospects for those left out by modernization, when all of these things are at an all-time low. I don't know the answer to this question, I'm very pessimistic. And I do know, however, that we in America cannot ignore it, for it hardly applies to Europe alone. Thanks a lot. I hope I didn't go on too long. So, are there times for questions? Can we take some questions? Or comments, or whatever?
David,
Please.
very much.
Thank you.
Very informative and unfortunately fear-inducing.
Yeah.
But I wonder how you perceive right now the situation in Great Britain with Theresa May about she needs to either jump or
We just
do
have,
something.
yeah. The question is, what's the scene right now in Britain? You all know that negotiations about the nature of Brexit are proceeding. The decision has to be reached by March 1919. And May's own government is in disarray. Three of its members have resigned. Recently, the most prominent Boris Johnson, foreign minister. And the question is, can Theresa May put together a formula that will be acceptable to the Parliament? It has to go to the Parliament, and also to the EU partners. I think the answer is no. I don't see it happening. I don't think she can do it. And I say this after talking to a number of people who are central to the negotiation. I've actually just written up on talking to people about this. The so-called Chequers Agreement, which is what she came up with as a compromise, is what made Johnson and Davies resign. But it's not enough to appease the EU either. So she's caught in a bind. She can't come up with a solution that is agreeable to the hardline pro-Brexiteers in her own cabinet and in the backbenches of the Conservative Party. And she probably can't go far enough in the other direction to appease the EU. So I think there'll be a cliff, falling off the cliff, right? And in which case we don't know exactly what's going to happen. That's uncharted territory.
And an election?
Yeah, it'll have to be an election, and there may be another referendum. That's also a possibility. But I just can't see how she is going to put together a viable program before March. So I think it's going to be this off the cliff business, which people are already talking about. That's going to mean, huge tie-ups at the borders, all kinds of goods not being able to get into Britain, and so forth and so on. And then there's the whole Northern Ireland issue that has the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland has to be clarified. It's hugely. A lot of people, when they voted for Brexit, had no clue about what this really happened. They just didn't know. They didn't know what it really mean. And there's some who have buyer's remorse now, and there's some who call for another referendum, but that's hard to do. So I think they'll just do this mess, this huge muddle, and we'll have to see how that goes. The EU wants to be hard on Britain because it doesn't want to encourage other countries to do the same thing, right? It doesn't want to make it easy for the Brits. There's a lot of animosity there too. On the other hand, there's huge trading agreements between, a huge amount of trade, and so you don't want to just cut Britain off entirely either. That would be bad. So it's a mess. Meantime, prices are going up for commercial properties in Frankfurt and Amsterdam, and so forth and so on. People thinking about all those businesses that will move from Britain to the continent. I was just talking to a friend of mine who's in real estate in Frankfurt, and he said prices are going to move in Frankfurt. That's already being done. Yes, please.
So do you see the European Commission taking any productive actions to counter the illiberal tendencies?
Not much. There's a debate coming up right now, actually, on whether or not to impose sanctions on Hungary. And, actually, interestingly enough, Austria has decided to join. France has decided to join the faction that will put pressure on Hungary. The trouble is, to put real pressure on Hungary, you have to have almost unanimity in the EU, and that's impossible to get. You can get mild sanctions without unanimity, but if you want to get really tough sanctions, you have to have the Poles on board as well, and the Slovakians and the Greeks, and that's not going to happen. So I think that there can be some sanctions against Hungary, and maybe Poland as well, because Poland also has violated basic EU principles with its tampering with the Supreme Court and the rest of it, and the free press. So, but the Commission has been very reluctant in the past to do much. It's been very, very reluctant to move. Just frightened of starting some kind of huge divide between East and West. There already is a divide, but maybe even worse. So no, the Commission hasn't done much. Yes. Yeah.
Can you hang on for 1 second? We'd like to get a microphone to you so we can capture your questions.
Oh, sure.
So everybody else can hear, but we can
Sure.
also capture.
Sure.
Given the tremendous research you've done over this period of related to populism, we're seeing this increasingly grow in the United States and throughout the world. And, one wonders about human tendencies towards tribalism. There are theories related to feeling of disempowerment by certain parts of the population, and naturally wanting to blame others for their dissent. And I wondered, when you look through history and all these different groups that you've studied and these different movements, you certainly captured the details of how they've happened and what their groups are. But I wondered what your own thoughts are when you start thinking about the primal motivation of humans, and what maybe some of the common thread is that allow these things to get going.
That's an excellent question, and I do think that I just hinted at the very beginning of my talk that there are real reasons for it. It's not just some kind of an invention by nasty chaps, you know, to cause trouble. These problems are real. People do feel disenfranchised. And there are reasons to feel disenfranchised in Europe because a lot of the Brussels bureaucracy is unelected. A lot of those decisions they make are they're not the product of any grassroots decisions. You know, they make decisions on regulation and so forth that are completely based on their own interpretations of what's best for the overall situation. So there's a real feeling of disempowerment. Plus, as you probably know, and I'll talk about the US situation here in a minute too, but in Europe, it's especially problematic because you have like 30% youth unemployment in many countries. I mean, the unemployment is terribly high, and there's just a feeling of hopelessness, of real hopelessness, where, I mean, people with university degrees in Italy, they can't find any jobs, right? And they move around within the EU hoping to find something. That's really their only chance, actually. But it's very dispiriting, and they look for solutions. They look for easy answers. They're frustrated, right? There are huge issues of income inequality in Europe as well as here. They're not quite as bad in Europe as here. We're really worse, but they're there in Europe as well. There's genuine impoverishment, and people feel frustrated over that as well, and they don't feel represented by the traditional mainstream parties. The consequence of which, you know, the traditional left party, which typically represented these people, the Labour Party in Britain, well, the Labour Party is actually doing a little better in Britain, but that's a special case. But the Social Party in France and in Germany and in Italy and so on, they've collapsed because there's just no faith in them anymore. And people are frustrated, they're full of fear. And of course they see migrants coming in and they think, oh God, these migrants are taking what we should have. In general, in fact, that's not generally the truth. I mean, the migrants are not taking jobs that these people would ordinarily have, but there's the perception that the migrants are coming in and somehow taking over. And of course, they do change the aspect, the look of the European cities. There's no question about that. I mean, you see a lot of mosques and towns. You see, you know, women in their Muslim women wearing the hijab and so forth and so on. And this upsets a lot of people who think that the traditional European values are being upset in return. And that's especially true when people feel, you know, disenfranchised and disempowered. If they were wealthy, of the elite. In this country, too, I mean, you know, there's the feeling that the mainstream parties, you know, the Democratic Party, for example, hasn't represented poor white people in rural areas, in the South, and so forth and so on. They feel left out. They feel that the Democratic Party cares only about minorities, gay rights, transgender issues, and things like that, and not about bread and butter issues for white people in Appalachia or farmers in Montana or whatever. You know what I mean? That's a real sense. And it's true that sometimes the Democratic Party has done a very bad job in this regard. It really has. There are reasons that it's lost support. I'm not a politician. I don't know exactly how to repair all of this, but it has to be done, or there's going to be real trouble. Again, this populism is not something that's just a fly-by-night thing. It's real, and it's powerful, and it's around the globe. Again, we can talk about Russia, we can talk about the Philippines, we can talk about you know, Southeast Asia. It's everywhere, right? People are revolting against the sense of disempowerment and disenfranchisement. Yeah. Go ahead, Ken.
Am I supposed to get that?
Oh,
Yeah, maybe two more?
sure. I'm happy to take any questions that you have time for.
Well, we don't want to keep you on the hook too long.
I know it's all right for me. I don't know what
We'll
you
go a little bit better.
Yeah, sure. Other questions? Absolutely.
Yeah, you began to touch on this, but the irony of the term populism to be used where, in fact, the leaders of many of these movements, I know a lot more about Berlusconi and Trump than I do about the other leaders.
Okay, well,
But they're absolutely not populists, they're elitists. And that is that's the most confusing element of the whole movement to me, is that the people that are disenfranchised may feel or might feel disenfranchised or be unemployed, can bond with these elitists that are actually leading the parties. And I don't get it.
Well, yes, it's certainly true that people like Berlusconi and Trump are very wealthy. They don't belong to the impoverished. They've never been impoverished themselves at all. But both of those characters have the capacity to talk to these people who feel disenfranchised. They've learned the trick of somehow identifying with these people. They're very good at that. I mean, I don't know exactly how they have learned to do it, but there's no question that somebody like Trump can talk to Appalachian coal miners in ways that they feel he's one of them, even though, of course, he's not really, you know. Really? There's a disconnect, and that doesn't matter. What matters is the feeling that is generated there, the sense of synergy, the sense of connectedness that's clearly there. If you look at a Trump rally or a Berlusconi rally, or Salvini too, did not come from poverty. Almost none of these people did. They have this capacity, or Enoch Powell was from wealthy, rich. They come from wealth, but they have the ability to relate to these people in ways that make the people feel that these guys are one of them. You know, and when they say the people, of course, they're meaning a particular part of the people. The problem with populism is that it's actually exclusivist. It says that the only people that deserve power are the people like us, the people who identify with us, in terms of look, in terms of origins, in terms of policies and ideas and aspirations. Those are the people, right? And so the others, they don't belong. They don't belong at all. And the thing about a populist victory generally is that it demands a total victory. It doesn't allow for the loyal opposition to have much of a role. Total populist victories occurred with fascism, of course. Fascism is a populist movement of an extreme sort, right? And it combines all the things I talked about before with extreme militarism, right? And kind of crusading vigor. But it does not allow for anything but that ruling party to have any clout. And populist leaders, once they win, are always on the hustings. They're never finished. They're always campaigning. They're always campaigning because there's the fear that somehow they'll lose touch with this populist base. Again, it is ironic that you have leaders like Trump and like Berlusconi who come from the very elite, but again, they manage to make that connection, and the people who follow them don't seem to resent the fact that they have wealth, that those people individually have wealth. In fact, sometimes they admire it. It's kind of an aspirational idea. Maybe I can be like that too, if I But you're right. It is a question. One more question. Yeah.
No, I was interested, by the way, to your point, you could add Shinawatra and Thailand to that list.
Oh, yeah. They're all over the place. Absolutely. Absolutely.
But on a different note, you made a reference, the perception of Germany was that they were bailing out the, Greece and a number of the countries.
That's right.
If you took it to the Greek level, there's a very different perception. Garifoukas has written extensively about it. Their perception, and I give a lot more credit, is saying that the European Union and the Germany in particular stepped in and bailed out Greece only to the extent to protect Deutsche Bank and German banks, and essentially elevate the exposure at the sovereign debt level. So through the solution on the shoulders, and you have a lot of that in Italy. So my question is, I live in Spain most of the year, so I see more of the populism on the left, but Syriza,
exactly. Syriza, Greece,
But I'm curious as to what the effect of the recession and the Great Recession and the restructuring is yet exacerbating a lot of these movements.
Absolutely,
on both sides.
Absolutely. The recession started in 2008. It was really, it was hard for us in this country, but much more devastating for southern Europe, Greece in particular. The Greeks, their fiscal policy was not exactly great. They did overspend. They were not as prudent as they should have been. They should have hosted the Olympics, for example. That was a mistake. They spent way too much, and so forth and so on. But you're right. I mean, the fact is that the Germans have always profited from the way the EU was structured, right? And this bailout was to protect those investors, right? I mean, that was the basic idea. And of course, this inflames hatred in Greece. I mean, they just hated the Germans for this. I mean, there were pictures of Merkel with a mustache like Hitler and so forth and so on. No question about that. These are real economic issues. Greece is in terrible shape. This austerity policy that's been imposed on Greece is incredibly destructive. I mean, these people are really struggling. I don't see how they can do it, how they can get out of this, because they're supposed to hold themselves up by the bootstraps, but the austerity measures were so severe that I think it's almost impossible for them to do it. Spain is not in quite as bad a situation, but it's not good. And Italy is another potential basket case. What Matteo Salvini wants to do is restructure the entire fiscal arrangement of the EU, whereby Brussels controls public spending. In order to be part of the Eurozone, you can't have public debt over 3% of your GDP, and he wants to scrap all of that, scrap all of the austerity. I think that austerity should be scaled back. I think it's much too, Germany shouldn't be the sole decider. Wolfgang Schäuble, who was the minister in Germany, kind of set these scales. I think it was destructive. So that should change. That's one thing the EU should do. Because you're right. I mean, there's the sense, and it's not entirely wrong, that Germany is profiting from all of this. Meanwhile, the Germans, however, think, oh, we're getting shafted. Here we are spending all this money to bail out these lazy Greeks, who can't find their ass with both hands. And, and that's AFD profits from this whole resentment on the part of the Germans of funding what they see as, profligate overspenders.
So we'll just add to that. I mean, the construct of the euro in and of itself locks in Germany's comparative advantage, the low labor cost environment, which speaks to why you get the 30% unemployment in the
absolutely. There are huge structural problems. I mean, we could go on and on and on about the structural problems within the EU. They are very, very serious. I don't know the answer to all of that. There has to be a lot of changes in terms of fiscal policy, the way the EU was run. But I don't think the answers are going to come from people like Salvini or Steve Bannon, who's working with Salvini in this movement. I don't think that's going to be the answer either. All right. On that note, there's one other. I think there's one other on the last question. Sure.
Thanks so much. I mean, sure. With respect to globalism, social democracies, do they and we not know how good they have it? And do we have it? Do they have it? From a historical perspective,
yes, no, we do have it. Yeah, in many ways, we're living better than ever before. There's no question about that. I mean, prosperity is really on the rise throughout the world. But it's unequal. It's vastly unequal. That's the trouble. Yes, a lot of people have been lifted from poverty, but many others are still wallowing in it. And the income inequality is larger now than it's been for a long, long time, as far as I know. Right? And that's the big problem. It's not that it's not so much just how well we're all doing, it's how well you think you're doing relative to somebody else. Right? And if you look at somebody else and they're doing so much better, then you get pissed off. It's not that you're literally starving to death, necessarily, though there is that in some places. But in Europe, it's not so much that. It's not that people are literally starving. But they look to other places, other parts of Europe and other parts of the world, and they see these huge disparities, and that pisses them off. Okay.
So, could there be anything to do with the rural exile?
I'm sorry, with what?
The rural exile, people leaving the countryside towards the city, because that's where the employment went after the industrialization of the agriculture. A huge amount of employment went away when machines replaced men. And then the populism, right, is mostly in countrysides.
That's continuing to be a problem. I mean, there's rural poverty, there is the mechanization of agriculture, but also industry to the degree that people without skills are going to find it increasingly difficult to get employment, right? I mean, this is a big problem coming down. There are estimations that in the next 10 years, 30% of a lot of the industrial jobs that are out there right now will be robotized, will be mechanized, and that will essentially put these people out of work. So if you're all high unemployment, now what's it going to be, 30 years from now, unless we figure out ways to deal with it? That's another huge problem on the horizon, mechanization. I mean, that started way back in the 18th century with, remember the Luddites in Britain, right, breaking the machines. So it's an old problem, but it's gotten a lot worse with robotization and all this sort of stuff. So that's just another wrinkle to face. Yeah. Finally, okay.
If you were the counterpart to Steve Bannon, you were,
I thought.
I mean, you were advising, let's say, Merkel and Macron on how to try to make this work and keep the EU together, and maybe appeal to some of the people who are not currently supporting you. What sort of advice would you give them?
The first thing would be to reverse some of the austerity programs, to try to cut back on that. I think those are just too demanding. I would say don't push forward quite so hard with the continued deepening of the EU, because it's causing so much frustration. I would say also cut back on a lot of the regulation that's out there. A lot of it is stupid. A lot of the EU regulations are really, really stupid. Like the regulations on the condom size. The Italians say that's way too small. The regulations on everything.
So there's a version of the Washington, D.C. bureaucrat.
Yeah, there is all of that. They need to find Macron, who, started out with such huge ratings, has really fallen in part because he's come on so much like a kind of presidential figure. He's wrapped himself in a kind of aura of royalty, which is a big mistake. He's lost his touch with people, and he's got to find a way to repair that damage. He's trying to, but it's not his nature. He's a typical grande coal creature, right? He comes out of this very elitist, educated society in France that has real difficulty relating to the guys from the sticks. Right. So those would be some of the things. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks a lot.
Yes.